So, when people ask me, oh, do an alternate history where the British get the Hawaiian Islands and keep them for some reason, I always have a hard job because the Hawaiian Islands are one of the few things the British government actively worked to not get. I mean, they literally actively worked to not have them. They actively worked because they didn't want them and they didn't want to have the job of defending them and they weren't useful to them. And when I say actively worked, the only time where you have a mild occupation of the islands in 1843, the British are basically it's a whole interesting scenario as to why the British end up occupying. Basically, it's a dispute between the British and the American, for want of better words, consuls. But the American consul is also the chief minister of the island, and it's to the extent most of their debates are involving a very hardline minister who wants the islands to basically not have any Catholics or anyone who doesn't agree with his specific version of Protestantism that includes people who are Church of England or anything else. It's a whole fun scenario which ends up serving as a classic example of why having people who are not professional diplomats as your senior diplomat in a place, people who have connections other than diplomacy, other than doing their duty to govern, as your diplomats, can realistically backfire quite badly. It can backfire quite badly. And in this scenario, well, I would argue that the events of 1843 lead to the later French occupation of the islands and lead to eventually the American takeover of the islands. It's all basically one ongoing saga. And the problem ultimately for the Hawaiians is they, due to their economic situation, due to their position in the middle of the Pacific, and due to the resources they have access to themselves, they do not really have the ability to dictate events. They can only be pulled along by them. A classic example is when the French occupied one of their forts with 140 Marines, and there's basically 2 people sitting in the fort. Everyone else has left and had abandoned it. And you sit there and go, I can, to an extent, understand. You were facing off against the French. They are a very powerful force at that point, but the fact that you left the guns behind to be spiked by the French shows not enough plan. You have enough time to abandon the fort and to realize you need to abandon the fort, and realize you're not going to deliver on the ultimatum. But honestly, if you'd managed to keep the guns, a lot of the 100, you might have been able to retake the fort should you wish at some point later on. Might have been useful, but no. The Kingdom of Hawaii is both a highly advanced state and a highly organized state, and at the same time really doesn't have enough preparedness for dealing with the world. And some of the ministers who tried to get it there, and there were some ministers who tried to get it there, who went on visits to Britain and America and all these places, the amount of them who end up dying mysteriously in storms is really intriguing. The ones who had best prepared the Hawaiian Islands to navigate the late 19th century in order to maybe survive and maintain their independence all seem to meet an end in a storm somewhere. It's amazing. Of course, it could be just the storms, it could be just the violence of the weather, but once would be a tragedy. Twice is a mystery. Once you're into double digits, then I'm sorry, but there's part of me, which is a historian, finds it very incredibly interesting how so many of these ministers seem to die in such a fashion. It just starts to become a habit. So, 1843, this is the flag of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and they have chosen a flag like this for a reason. They're dealing with American and British interests. Those are the big powers as far as they're concerned. But to be honest, there is a difference going on here. The Americans are more concerned with Hawaii than the British by a long stretch. For the Americans, it's key to their trans-Pacific trade. For the British and the British Empire, most of its trade does not cross the Pacific. Most of its trade goes back through the Indian Ocean, Suez Canal route, Mediterranean to the UK, and all out, or goes across the Atlantic Ocean. So, why are the British to an extent interested? Well, they're interested as a place for their ships, especially their warships, to stop. And there are some merchants there. So for the British, it's a useful neutral port. It's not got a land border with any major other European nation colonies, so it's not going to be taken that way. And as long as the other powers don't get too heavily involved and there's a balance of interests, it's all okay. The problems that are going to come about are if Hawaii grows, either is taken over by another power, or Hawaii grows to the point at which it is not open for people to come in. Now, the thing is, the British are quite happy to go up there and trade, and there are British people on the Royal Council. Before you start thinking it's just an American-run affair, no, there is actually a British gentleman who's the foreign minister, and I'll talk about through their council at the time in a bit. The kings, the queens of Hawaii have been very clever at how they run things. It's not just a flag which is balanced. It's a lot of the ideas which are balanced for Hawaii as they go through. And they have tried very carefully to navigate the line. I'd also say, before we get into this, and you have to deal with, again, kind of like the War of 1812, there is a bit of mythology which goes along with 1843, especially from the one nation which tends to remember it more. Well, how do I put this? The Hawaiians remember it for a very interesting reason, and we'll be talking about the reason. There's a park called Thomas Park in Hawaii as we go on. But also occasionally America remembers it as well. And for America, one of the usual things you have is their frigates show up and, the Royal Navy backs down. It's really not like that. In fact, pretty much the whole time the British are there occupying and doing whatever the British are doing, there are American frigates there. Usually the Boston. And they're a constant presence, but honestly, the Americans aren't prepared to fight a war over the Hawaii with the British either. It gets interesting because of the various connections and as we go on, but neither side wants to fight a war of Hawaii. It's not worth it. But neither side really wants Hawaii to go to the other. To be fair, the British care less than the Americans do, because for the Americans, it's got strategic value. For the British, it's a good place to get water. But there is a small problem. As time goes on, as issues raise up, and this is part of the reason why 1843 happens, there are British traders there. There are British merchants there. And as long as everyone's allowed to run on a fairly even playing field, it's fine. The moment people start trying to be excluded or not found against in legal proceedings for religious reasons, mainly because you're not fitting with the particular preacher who's popular with the royal family's point of specific religion, then there's a problem. And this is realistically what we're dealing with. And as said, to be fair, what we actually find ourselves dealing with, and I'll get into this, is a dispute between Garrett B. Judd, who's the American sort of counsel, also sort of senior first minister for the king, and Richard Charlton, who is the British minister, who is fighting all sorts of court cases, which mostly get found against him when he leaves the islands to go and try and find support from the Royal Navy. But most of their issues boil down to Hiram Bingham I, the preacher. It's honestly a bit of a nightmare between the two. Charlton had been a member of the East India Company, but he moves into the Pacific as early as 1821. He has a lot of experience there. He arrives in Tahiti in 1823, and when Kamehameha II and his queen Kamiolu died in 1824 while in London, seeing trying to want to see the King of Great Britain at the time, there was a deep embarrassment felt by the British government about their deaths. It was not good. They wanted to formalise relations, and so when the USA has appointed another merchant tradesman as an unpaid consular agent, the British decided to appoint Charlton as the same to Hawaii. And he gets there in 1824. He took his wife, Betsy, her sister, a daughter, all sorts of things. He reaches there 1825, and he starts having a lovely time. Now the thing is, Bingham is the leader of the Congregational Church, and a very conservative preacher. Please note, before you get into this, there is nothing, I'm not saying anything against religion here or any batch of Christianity here. I really am not. But Bingham, from various sources, even some of the American ones I've read, seems to be fairly my way or the highway preacher, which you do have going around in the 19th century, a lot more common than we have today. Far more common in the 19th century is to have very full of zeal, but also very much you must either agree with me or you should burn kind of preaching. That's far less common today in most of in Britain and America, but it was more common in this period. And well, Charlton and him basically start to end up having conflicts over things. It starts quite early on in the basic treatment of a gentleman called, I think, Bokeh, but I'm not quite precisely sure, who was a senior minister in the Hawaiian Islands and Kingdom of Hawaii. And he was, how to put this, very happy to indulge in vices which were not happy to the missionaries, but were perfectly happy brought in, was trying to push forward the economy. He dies. He dies some point in 1829, and even before that, there had been issues, even other issues. There'd also been issues with a British captain, I think a gentleman called William Buckle. He was accused by another missionary called Richards of human trafficking because he bought a woman. What it seems more likely was he paid a dowry and then married a woman, but the thing is, he didn't marry in the missionaries' church. And when they tried to get Richard sent to England to be charged with libel, which was theoretically allowed under the treaties they had, theoretically, the Queen declared him innocent because, well, she was persuaded by Bingham that it was terrible. He was, of course, talking the truth because he was a man of God. And possibly he was even talking the truth as he saw it, because in his view, he didn't like the idea of dowries. But that seemed to be something where the husband basically gave the family some money. Gave the family some money for it. I'm not sure. They seem, as from all the reports I've read, they seem to have had quite a happy, successful marriage for the 19th century. So make of it what you will. I know I find it all kind of petty, but it's the sort of things which keep running on and running on. And at one point in 1837, in 1836, Charlton asked for the Navy to help secure the release of 2 British prisoners who were being held because of religious reasons, it was felt. And in 1837, actually, the Royal Navy managed to bring some Catholic priests to open a parish for the first time because, yes, the Royal Navy supporting Catholicism, they just think it needs to be in balance. There's a lot of Catholic sailors stopping off there. There's a lot of Catholics' involvement. And their view was, well, if we drop them off, then it won't start a war. Because the other worry was it would be France or Spain, which might be actually like the Hawaiian Islands, would drop them off, and then when they were kicked out, that would be considered casus belli by the 2 Catholic powers. So the Royal Navy was dropping off Catholic priests, and that was done by HMS Sulphur in 1837. And things just keep going on. They keep getting issues and disputes and fights and legal battles and legal challenges, and it's at this point that Charlton actually leaves in September 1842 to present his case to the British government, to go and say, look, this is how badly I've been treated. On his way, though, he bumps into Lord George Paulet, captain of the Carrisford, Royal Navy frigate. And how do I put this? Well, he basically tells him, look, everything's going to go against me, but I have to go because this is all being rigged against me. And to an extent, he possibly has some argument on that one, because all the juries, which happen to be, out of all the tradesmen, almost entirely composed of Americans, on those juries judging against him, find against him. They all find against him while he's away. And so Paulet is in a difficult position, because technically it's not just a trader who's in trouble, a British trader who's in trouble. It's technically a representative of the British Crown, because he's a diplomat. You ever see that problem I've talked about before, of people who win too big, too quickly? In this scenario, they've put the Royal Navy in an impossible position, because by winning so great, they might be in the right. But that doesn't, technically, because of the way this is being portrayed, and it's going back, and it has been reported to the British government by the British diplomats, it looks like you're insulting the British government and the British people, and in this period, that's a massive affront. And that's not a sternly worded apology time, or sternly worded letter time. That is a, hello, have you met my frigate? I've got a lot of guns time. And that is pretty much what happens. This is what leads to the Paulet Affair. As I said, it's been an ongoing dispute. It's been an ongoing issue. And I would say, I'm going to add this point here, it's a crucial thing. Because when the complaint goes in to Paulet, Paulet sends a message to Rear Admiral Thomas, his senior officer. And he gives him permission to go and investigate the allegations as best he can. and find a report. And that is quite literally what Paulet is probably aiming to do, with a little bit of emphasis of, we are Britain, you're supposed to respect us, sort of thing. Now, again, it's not the way we necessarily do things, but it's the way they're supposed to be done. Now, one of the key things you have is that, as part of these disputes, basically there has been sufficiently bad blood generated between Judd and Charlton that, as far as Charlton's reported to everyone in the British thing, Judd is the second coming of the devil. The first coming being, of course, the burning of bush. This is what he is pushing forward. This is what he's trying to, trying to really, emphasize. Judd is evil. Judd won't listen. Judd is all Judd does is work with the American missionaries and cause trouble. Judd doesn't do his job properly or responsibly, or even-handed legal manner. All these things are coming through. Now, the thing is, if you look at the disputes, Judd is actually a fairly good minister, apart from when it comes to Charlton. Okay? So before people start going to sit down and go, well, no, Judd's a good... You can. But when it comes to Charlton, he seems to be an absolute bum. He's doing everything he can. And you can say, yes, they're competitors, all these things, but the moment you have one is technically the diplomatic representative of the British government, and one is technically the Chief Minister of Hawaii, this adds an extra frisson to the atmosphere. They're not just tradespeople competing. They're not just merchants competing. They are government ministers. And I would say I think Judd forgot that part of the equation. I think Judd didn't necessarily think about that part of the equation, despite the fact that the Navy has turned up in response past to Carlton having issues, especially with diplomatic, religious freedom and these things. And mercantile freedom and religious freedom are usually what Britain is requiring at this point. That's usually what they're requiring. So, Paulet is now on his way in Carrisford. And this is when this starts to get bad. But you have to remember, at no point in this has the British government directly itself yet been involved. They've been appraised of the situation. They have lodged complaints to the Americans. The Americans have, at certain points, responded with, we have no frigate what Judd's doing. Or, is he our minister? No, he's not at the moment. But, our minister is his trading partner. And there's all sorts of fun going on. It's just all fun and games. It really is. So we're into a shameless book plug before we get into the rest of this, but I want to say thank you to everyone for supporting the channel, thank you for being so kind, so helpful, making the channel possible. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. And all those things which help the channel grow. Thank you. I know this is a bit delayed this week, so I'm going to apologise now. It was supposed to go out Tuesday, it's hopefully going to go out Wednesday, and if it hasn't been uploaded in time, it'll go out Friday. There are reasons for this. One, as you may or may not know, I was away last week, doing my normal thing of Justin Craiging. It's a A-level and GCSE revision company I go and work for occasionally as a course director. And they're a lovely firm, they're lovely people, they're really good if you're doing A-level and GCSE research, and this is not a paid ad, it's just the nicest way. I wouldn't have worked for them for nearly 15 plus years if they weren't a good company to work with and they weren't good for the students. It's been a lot of fun over the years, and I've been a course director for many of those years. But leaving that all to one side, while I was away, I also had time to do a lot of studies into the YouTube algorithm at the moment and to watch a lot of videos. And one of the things I've worked out is if I do more videos which I think are interesting, when I think a video is interesting, if I make it a Patreon premiere, that tends to make it grow exponentially more than if I just leave it as a normal video coming out. Which is why I'm doing more Patreon premieres, because people can then watch them as they want afterwards. But in the when it first goes live, it's basically a watch along with a chat, which I quite like. I really do quite like in some ways. So yeah, that's why there's more of those coming out. They get more of a boost and seem to get more people watching them. So thank you everyone for supporting the channel. Thank you for watching the videos. Thank you for suggesting the suggestions. Currently there is Patreon suggestions. It's live for May. The Patreon vote will begin quite soon for May. I'm trying to get a little bit ahead. Ideally in March I would like to be doing not April, May, I'd like to be doing June's videos. So I'd like to have 2 months clear. And the reason I'd like to be doing that is because in September, October this year, I'm hopefully off to Japan. And it's going to straddle those 2 months. And I want to have be able to make sure I've got all the Patreon videos sorted out before I go. So it's all those 2 months videos. I want them recorded before I leave. I'm already starting to record the videos now. I'm literally trying to record and add into my weeks, every week, sort of an extra couple of videos I'm recording to try and get myself ahead. So I'm recording videos a week or so in advance, so I have less of the issues when I have, like I've had for the last couple of days, come back a lot of things to sort of fix at the house which got broken while I was away, which have problems while I was away, and so I'm now fixing them. I'd like that to be less of a problem. And so I'd like to be sort of similar level as we were when I was at home, at previous home back in Surrey. And I'd like to have that stockpile for those 2 months done well in advance, so that basically when we're away, I can concentrate on being in Japan, and for those weeks I can concentrate on prepping for Japan. So if all the videos barring the lives are all done well in advance, then everything's a lot easier. Anyway, thank you very much for your support, and thank you for helping the channel keep going, and me buy all the books which underpin it. So, King Kamehameha? The third is... well, he comes to the throne sort of unexpectedly, mainly because his parents die in Britain. The weather's never good. We'll leave that to one side. But the thing is, he's in power. He's doing his best to sort things out. He's doing his best to make things work. And the best way he can make things work is by appointing people who he sees are capable, or the best options he has for capability, to the roles. 1843, he is off wandering through the islands. And a Royal Navy warship arrives and says, I want to have a conversation with you. 'Cause we have some issues. Now, the thing is, just a small point is, they're not saying necessarily we have to have a conversation right now. What they're saying they sort of want is a conversation with the king directly. Not unusual. Not unusual in this period. Again, when you consider what navals often are trusted with, usually it's quite normal for them to turn up and go, "We'd like to speak to the local ruler now. Would you like to speak to his chief minister?" Nope. We want to speak to him or her, or whomever it is. We want to speak to the boss. That's kind of, in 1840s, what the Royal Navy and the British government expect. When a Royal Navy captain turns up, especially one who's a lord, so part of the British aristocracy, they expect to speak with the aristocratic ruler, or whatever the ruler is of the local area. Now, would they turn up in America and expect to speak to the president? Probably not. But it does depend on the scale of the nation you're dealing with. a captain would probably expect if he arrived in New York City to have a conversation with the senior naval officer of the port, to maybe have a meeting with the mayor, just as part of the normal diplomatic things of, oh, we're a friendly warship visiting, etc. Do you have any problems with Britain, British citizens at this point? If you do, please tell us. If you don't, if there are any problems British citizens have with you at this point, they'll use this opportunity to pass it on. And usually, of course, any British consular officials. And the problem is, with Charlton being away, the person who Charlton had appointed as his acting representative in his absence isn't accepted in that role by either the other nation's representatives who are in Hawaii or by the government in Hawaii. Which was actually possibly another of the more stupid things they could do. Okay? Because this means they're not accepting the person who would be the natural go-between, who would be explaining what's happening on with the government to the Royal Navy officer. They've cut him out the loop. So now instead of having someone who would explain, well, of course it's going to be about 6 days for the king to come back from the island he's on. He'll be back in 6 days, so you'll just have to wait till he comes down there, and would pass on a message to the government. No, we don't want to meet with the First Minister. We have to wait till the Chief Government Minister. We have to wait till the King's here. They're communicating directly with the warship. Do you see how I say that this is a lot of people shooting themselves in the foot by going for an absolute win for themselves? It's both sides, the Brits and the British and Americans, and it's not the governments here going for the win, it's the merchants. By not recognising Charlton's appointed successor, they can ignore him in the judicial proceedings, which is why they can rule so easily against Charlton, which they do. Okay, in his absentia. Which is great for them to win that. But that means when the warship turns up, oh, frigate, we've not just insulted the diplomat, we've now refused to accept the person he's appointed as his acting, using the phrase of them. And whilst we can do all this, by doing all this means now we're now talking with a Royal Navy captain who's not a Pacific specialist, doesn't really understand what's going on, is filling in the role, and he's going to revert to the manual. That's not a good scenario for you to be in. So, he sent a letter on the 11th of February 1843, which was a very diplomatic letter when he arrived. And it basically was a thing of, hey, can we have a meet, Your Highness? And when told no, he sends another letter on the 16th of February. Now, this letter is the beginning of the correspondence. It truly is. With that being said, let's consider some of these letters, shall we? So, the letter on the 11th, one of the great things is you can find copies of all these letters. You can find a nice PDF file you can download. Link should be below if I've posted it correctly on this channel. This is the letter from the 11th of February. Having arrived at this port in Her Britannic Majesty's his ship Carrisford under my command, for the purpose of affording protection to British subjects, as likewise to support the position of Her Britannic Majesty's representative here, who has received repeated insults from the government authorities of these islands, respecting which it is my intention to communicate only with the King in person. I require to have immediate information by return of the officer conveying this transaction, whether or not the King, in consequence of my arrival, has been notified that his presence will be required here, and the earliest day on which he may be expected, as otherwise I shall be compelled to proceed to his residence in the ship under my command for the purpose of communicating with him. Then a response from the governor of Oahu. Salutations to you, Lord George Paulet, captain of Her Britannic Majesty's ship Carrisford. I have received your letter by the hand of the officer. Respect to inform you that we have not as yet sent for the king, as we were not informed of the business. But having learned from your commission that you wish him sent for, I will search for a vessel and send. He is at Waliuku, on the east of side of Maui. In case the wind is favourable, you may be expected in 6 days. It's fine. So, then we have the one from the 16th. I have the honour to acquaint your Majesty of the arrival in this port of Her Britannic Majesty's ship under my command, and according to my instruction, I am desired to demand a private interview with you, to which I shall proceed with a proper and competent interpreter. I therefore request to be informed at what hour tomorrow it will be convenient for your Majesty to grant me an interview. Now, please note, that's sent on the 16th. The first letter was sent on the 11th. 6 days, roughly 17th. He's given the time they've requested for them to have that. Unfortunately, the message he receives in response is, "Salutations to you, Lord George Paulet," and this is from the King himself, Captain of Her Britannic Majesty's ship Carrisford. "We have received your communication of yesterday's date and must decline having any private interview, particularly under the circumstances which you propose. We shall be ready to receive any written communication from you on tomorrow, and will give it due consideration. In case you have business of a private nature, we will appoint Dr. Judd, our confidential agent, to confer with you, who, being a person of integrity and fidelity to our government and perfectly acquainted with all our affairs, will receive your communication, give you all the information you require in confidence, and report the same to us with respect. Kamehameha Third." Oops. So, it's going so well. Communication, right then, I want to talk to you. No, you don't get to talk to me. You have to talk to the Chief Minister. Chief Minister's the person here I'm going to complain about. Because of how he's been acting. And please note, the code here is said in the first message, which we're going to presume was passed on to Kamehameha. Considering how quickly he got back there, it probably was. It is Her Britannic Majesty's representative here, who has received repeated insults from the government authorities of these islands. That point, it's code for no, this is not time for your Chief Minister. This is not. You've been insulting the ambassador. I'm a warship here as far as we're concerned. I'm a warship here. I'm here as a representative of the government. I'm therefore here to ensure that you are not mistreating us. Because it's one thing to have a trade dispute between merchants. It's quite another thing to have a dispute with a government representative. Diplomatic community and all these fun things. And this then carries on. Oh, it carries on to what? You want a hug? Okay. All right. You're lovely. Can I get back to the letters? Okay, good boy. Right. Sorry, poodle interruption. The response from Paulet. So, in answer to your question of this day's date, which I have too good an opinion of your Majesty to allow me to believe even ever emanated from yourself, but from ill advisers, I have to state that I shall hold no communication whatever with Dr. G.P. Judd, who it has been satisfactorily proved to me, has been the prime mover in the unlawful proceedings of your government against the British subjects. As you have refused me a personal interview, I enclose to you the demands which I consider it to be my duty to make upon your government, with which I shall demand a compliance at or before 4 o'clock p.m. tomorrow Saturday, otherwise I shall be obliged to take immediate coercive steps to obtain these measures for my countrymen. Now let's consider these demands. First, the immediate removal by public advertisement written in native and English languages and signed by the Governor of Ireland and F.W. Thompson of the attachment placed upon Mr. Charlton's property, the restoration of land taken by government for its own use, and the really appertaining to Mr. Charlton, and reparation for the heavy loss to which Mr. Charlton's representatives have been exposed by the oppressive and unjust proceedings of the Sandwich Islands government.
Second, the immediate acknowledgement of the right of Mr. Simpson to perform the functions delegated to him by Mr. Charlton, namely that of Her Britannic Majesty's acting consul, until Her Majesty's pleasure be known upon the reasonableness of your objections to him. The acknowledgement of that right and the reparation of for the insult offered to Her Majesty through her acting representative to be made by a public reception of his commission and a saluting the British flag with 21 guns, which then will be returned by Her Britannic Majesty's ship under my command. So far, nothing too egregious here. It's basically, okay, right then. You have mucked around with a diplomatic official, okay? You can't do this. This is not going to be tolerated. Just sort these things out. Third, a guarantee that no British subject shall in future be subject to imprisonment in fetters unless he is accused of a crime which by the laws of England will be considered a felony. I.e., nothing to do with religious persecution going on here. Fourth, the compliance with a written promise given by the King Kamehameha to Captain Jones of Her Britannic Majesty's ship Curacao that a new and fair trial be granted in a case brought by Henry Skinner, British subject, against J. Thomas, American citizen, which promise has been evaded. Fifth, the immediate adoption of fair steps to arrange the matters in dispute between British subjects and natives of the country, or others residing here, by referring those cases to juries, 1/2 of whom shall be British subjects approved by the Council, and all by the Consul, and all of whom shall declare on oath their freedom from prejudgment upon or interest in the cases brought before them. Sixth, a direct communication between His Majesty Kamehameha and Her Britannic Majesty's acting consul for the immediate settlement of all cases of grievances and complaint on the part of the British subjects against the Sandwich Islands government. Dated the 17th of February. Now, none of this is demanding, oh, you now become a subject of the British Crown or anything. You can consider the things about the judiciary, the 50-50 idea to be an interesting one. I do consider it an interesting one, but it's not about precedence, and it's part of the existing framework they're supposed to be acting at the time. It's part of the existing framework. It's part of the standard policies. So whilst it's very strange for us probably to hear today, at those times it's not unusual in this sort of scenario. Because, it could be that the jury being made up of 50-50, it gives a chance of it means that the jury can be one British person could vote against them, or one Islander could vote for them, and all these things. But also it allows for a debate and understanding and a common understanding to be brought of the law. Because again, you've come from the British judicial system, you're going into the Hawaiian judicial system, you have all sorts of other things going on with conventions. Any territory which is technically owned by a merchant who's in a country who's appointed as consul could be said to be acting consular grounds. So, whilst again, they might well have done the legally correct thing in judging against Charlton, they might have done. Technically, those are grounds. Now, the smart thing would have been to accept the person who was appointed, Simpson, as the acting consul. And after you've accepted him as acting consul, then disputed Charlton's right to be the consul, said you no longer find him satisfactory, but you do find Mr. Simpson satisfactory, sent that message to the British government. Once they've agreed and gone, okay, we'll transfer it to Simpson, then judge against Charlton and take lands off him. That's what you should do sensibly. At this point, what you've done is basically a grave insult to the nation state of Britain. It's not that we disagree with you. Charlton might be a bad guy. We don't really care about that. That doesn't matter. What matters is he's the British consul. And when you consider the very phrasing of the first paragraphs and all this point is about his status as the British consul and British subjects. And this is what's carrying on. This is what's happening. This is what they're talking about. This is not about we want to take over Hawaii. It's just, at this point, it's still a run-of-the-mill, regular, oh, great, we have to deal with this scenario. And all the while this is going on, USS Boston is sitting in the harbour, watching it all going. To be fair, her captain seems to be doing something along the lines of, told you this was going to happen! When some people, there are different discussions as to whether or not there were various people who suggested he should interfere with the British frigate. He would just basically look at him and no, but you're an American ship. You want us to start a war over you guys doing some aggressive trading practices and deciding to pick a fight between each other and not figuring out, hang on, one of you's a government minister and one of you's a diplomatic representative. No, we don't want to get into a war over this. We really don't. We remember the War of 1812. It wasn't fun. It really wasn't fun. And it's the 1840s. The British have less distractions at this point. We do not want to repaint the White House again. Yes, we're in a better position than we were then, but no, our infrastructure is still not great. And frankly, in many ways, we're under worse funding conditions from the Congress than we were then. They really are. Have a look. The poor U.S. Navy, they're more often lose to Congress than they do to anything else. But yeah. So that's carrying on. And while that's carrying on, the letters carry on. And the letters lead to some fun things. After receiving that message and those demands, the king suddenly goes, "Oh, frigate! They are a British frigate, and they're not playing games. Okay. Maybe the ministers really didn't tell Kamehameha what was going on. I doubt that myself, but possibly they didn't. But at that point, they're forced that someone does tell them what's going on. And so they get the message back. I have received your communication and make known to you that I will receive yourself and Her Britannic Majesty's representative on Monday the 20th of February at 11 o'clock a.m. Yours faithfully." Now, that meeting was apparently one for the ages. And there are daily meetings between Alexander Simpson, who's the acting minister. He's been accepted at this point. At this point, someone seems to have turned around to Judd, and the other government ministers have gone, "You do realise we are currently absolutely up the creek without a paddle if we're just dealing with a naval officer, because his latitude fraction is actually less than a consul. If a consul has more freedom for action than a naval officer. A naval officer has to uphold the protection of his sovereign citizens, and he only has one method at his disposal to uphold that. That's naval force. So we want there to be an acting consul. So we are going to quickly, rapidly recognize Alexander Simpson." Now, the claim from King Kamehameha was, after daily meetings between 20th and 23rd, and he has the captain there, Paulet there, as well as Simpson. He agrees that disputed cases should be reopened, but he says he will not overrule the courts and ignore due process. But if you again go back, the thing wasn't about ignoring due process. It was following what had been agreed as the rough rules for process. Now, to be fair, the British government probably wouldn't object to that, and neither would Paulet. But the trick would be to make sure that certain of the judgments, especially any ones which look like they're going to be impinging on consular territory, do reverse. And whilst you can go, we do not get involved in these things. We do not do those things. It doesn't really work that way. So what happens? Well, on the 25th of February, the agreement was signed which ceded the land subject to any diplomatic resolution. Paulet appoints himself and 3 others to a commission to be the new government and take direct control of all land transactions. Because what are their worries over land transactions? It's literally the consular territory. You can't start taking embassy land off it by order of court or all those things. You might claim you have agreement, but the thing is, you've got to be sure it's correct, and it's got to be above beyond reproach. And it wasn't. Now, I would actually say that looking at the cases, there is a good argument on both sides here. It's something that's open up to argue court. But the trouble is, again, it's the complication, is that on one side, you have someone who's firmly connected with a government minister, and on the other side, you have someone who is another government's representative. And so you have turned a mercantile dispute into a national dispute. This is a problem. And this is what leads to what happens next. As said, on the 25th of February. On here, we have... Now first we have a letter from Kamehameha. In consequence of the difficulties in which we find ourselves involved, and our opinion of the impossibility of complying with the demands in a manner in which they are made by Her Britannic Majesty representative upon us, in reference to the claims of British subjects, we do hereby cede the group of islands known as the Hawaiian or Sandwich Islands unto the Right Honourable Lord George Paulet, Captain of Britannic Majesty's ship of war, Carrisford, representing Her Majesty Queen Victoria, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, from this date, and for the time being. The said secession being made with the reservation that is subject to any arrangement that may be have been entered into by the representatives appointed by us to treat with the government of Her Britannic Majesty, and in the event that no agreement has been executed previous to the date hereof, subject to the decision of Her Britannic Majesty's government on conference with the said representatives appointed by us, or in the event of our representatives not being accessible, or not having been acknowledged, subject to the decision which Her Britannic Majesty may pronounce on receipt of full information from us and from the Right Honourable Lord George Paulet. In confirmation of the above, we hereby affix our name and seals on this date, 25th February, in the year of our Lord, 1843, at Honolulu, Oahu, Sandwich Islands. Now, that's quite a big thing. That is a big thing. That is a big statement. And then we had the proclamation from Lord George Paulet. A provisional cession of the Hawaiian or Sandwich Islands having been made this day by Kamehameha III, King and Kekue, Premier thereof, unto me, to the Right Honourable Lord George Paulet, commanding Her Britannic Majesty's ship Carrisford, on the part of Her Britannic Majesty Victoria, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, subject to arrangements which may have been or shall be made in Great Britain with the government of Her Britannic Majesty. I do hereby proclaim that first, that the British flag shall be hoisted on all the islands of the group, and natives therefore shall enjoy the protection and privileges of British subjects. That the government thereof shall be executed until the receipt of communications from Great Britain in the following manner. Namely, by the native king and chiefs and officers employed by them, so far as regard as a native population, and by a commission consisting of King Kamehameha III, or a deputy appointed by him, the Right Honourable Lord George Paulet, Duncan Forbes Mackay, Esquire, and Lieutenant Frere, Royal Navy, in all that concerns relations with other powers, save and except the negotiations with the British government, and the arrangements among foreigners, other than the natives of the archipelago, resident on these islands. Third, that the laws at present existing, or which may be made at the ensuing council of the chiefs, king and chiefs, after being communicated to the commission, shall be in full force so far as natives are concerned, and shall be formed the basis of the administration of justice by the commission in matters between foreigners resident on these islands. Fourth, in all that relates to the collection of the revenue, the present officers shall be continued at the pleasure of the native kings and chiefs, their salaries for the current year being also determined by them, and the archives of the government remaining in their hands. The accounts are, however, subject to inspection by the commission, therefore named. The government vessels shall be, in the like manner, subject, however, to their employment, if required for Her Britannic Majesty's service. Fifth, that no sales, leases, or transfers of land shall take place by the action of the commission appointed as aforesaid, nor from natives to foreigners, during the period intervening between the 25th or 4th of this month and the receipt of notification from Great Britain of the arrangements made there. They shall not be valid, nor shall they receive the signatures of the King and the Premier. And it carries on. All the existing bona fide engagements of the native king and Premier shall be executed and performed as if this secession had never been made. Given under my hand this 25th of February, 5th day of February, in the year of the Lord 1843 at Honolulu, Oahu, Sandwich Islands. Now, the thing is, if you're listening and going, well, Alex, that's easy. The British have just taken over. They haven't. And this is where one of the interesting things comes in, because part of this is there's already diplomatic negotiations going on with the British to try and resolve things. There are already ministers being sent. And Paulet includes as part of this thing of sending people across. And Paulet decides to send Alexander Simpson back to Britain so that he can pass on the information of what's happened since Charleston's left and, explain these things. Well, Judd, that lovely American minister, also invites an American merchant, James F.B. Marshall, to go and explain to the Americans what's going on. And here's the fun thing. There is a whole dispute as to whether Marshall had only told Paulet that he was on a business mission when he leaves on the Albert, which is a British ship, or whether they know he's on a diplomatic mission. Because from some of the things which Paulet says later, and in discussions, there is a point at which they understood that he was going to go tell the Americans, but they weren't really bothered about him going telling the Americans and explaining what was going on to the Americans. Because there's a frigating American warship sitting there, watching this most of the time, going, I'm seeing it happening in front of me. The thing is, it's kind of interesting about what happens and where they go, because Simpson goes to England. Marshall goes to Boston. Marshall doesn't stop with the west coast of America. He knows he won't get any support there. There are too many people who know the Hawaiian Islands, know the trade that's going on, know that the merchants there have been getting pretty cutthroat between the two, and are going, hang on. No, Marshall is pretty focused. He goes to the American press. He goes to fellow Bostonians, such as Daniel Webster, who's the Secretary of State at the time. And he also goes to his business partner and another future Minister of Hawaii, Henry A. Pierce. And he also, carries on and does duties, heads to England as well, with letters for the American ambassador in Britain, Edward Everett. So, when June, Marshall arrives in London, meets with Everett, there are also Hawaiian envoys there, William Richards and Timothy Hahelo. They're in Paris, negotiating treaties with the French at the time. But then they start having negotiations with various British people. Even before they've arrived, so this is the point at which you think it's getting really interesting, because the Americans go, well, they arrive in London this way. On April the 1st, Lord Aberdeen, who's the foreign minister, I'll be talking about him in a bit, had already said, a letter to the Hawaiian delegation, Her Majesty's government was willing and had determined to recognise the independence of the Sandwich Islands under the present sovereign. That's the 1st of April 1843. If we think about that, Simpson doesn't arrive in England till June. Late May, early June. Marshall doesn't arrive in England till the 30th of June. They are months late. The British government's already said what their decision is. They respect the existing government. They just need this to be sorted out, and you need to stop having diplomatic fights
between merchants engaging in diplomatic fights, and we're going to have to figure out how we're going to sort this out in a way that doesn't, how do I put this, embarrass either government, because that's part of the trouble. You see, the thing is, Paulet has in many ways been forced down this position because of the supposed affront to the British government caused by this attack on their representative. If you're thinking this is very small children in the playground playing, you would not be mistaken. I am honestly sure this is often a scenario which nursery school tutors find themselves dealing with. Okay, but this is diplomacy in the 19th century, and the egos of countries you're having to deal with. With all that being said, first constellation arrives in earlier July, and then on the 22nd of July, USS United States arrives with Commodore Thomas Catesby Jones. And they arrive and they are watching things. They consult with various American missionaries when they arrive. And they're there and going, okay, we're here to watch what's going on. Please note, they arrive on the 22nd of July. They do nothing. They're watching what's going on, but they're not forcing the British out. They're just there watching. And honestly, Commodore Thomas Catesby Jones is a fairly good operator for the US Navy. He's fairly understanding. He's in charge of their Pacific Squadron. And he realizes the situation he's in. He realizes the reality of any conflict which he'd end up fighting. He might end up with local superiority of ships. In fact, honestly, the forces are pretty darn balanced. When you consider the Carisfoot and the Dublin, which is what Rear Admiral Thomas will turn up in. They're a pretty balanced force. Neither's really striking to outshine each other. And also, the thing is, the American government have noted what has happened and realised that the British government has been put in a bind. In other words, the American merchants and the British merchants in disputes went a bit too far for each other, and they've brought this on. Now someone's going to need to find a way to walk it back, aren't they? Someone is going to need to find a walk it back. But the thing is, the captain can't walk it back. He's done what he needs to do for the protection of British Crown. There is a reason why Paulet doesn't suffer from this and ends up going on to being an admiral. And ends up going on to have quite a lot of success and other operations. He fights in the Crimean War. He does all sorts of other duties. He is a respected officer in the Royal Navy. Because whilst he did this action, he was acting within the bounds of protecting the honour of the British Crown. But the trouble is, he's now made a job for someone else who does turn up. And this is Rear Admiral Thomas. The British Rear Admiral arrives. And he arrives on the 26th of July. He's been dealing with stuff. Before you just wonder what the British Rear Admiral in the Pacific is doing, it's more important than this. Why is it going on? South America. I'm just going to say South America. He's been sorting out that mess. Dealing with all sorts of things going on. And slowly the messages about Hawaii have gone from oh to oh frigate to oh my frigate to oh Lord my frigate above thee. It's just got worse and worse and worse. And he arrives, and he arrives on the 26th, and this is what he puts out on the 26th. Rear Admiral Thomas to the Governor of Oahu. It being my desire to obtain the honour of a personal interview with His Majesty King Kamehameha III for the purpose of conferring with His Majesty on the subject of the provisional cession of his dominions, I have to request you be pleased to intimate my wishes to His Majesty in order that he may be appointed the time and place whereby such an interview may be held. I.e., Rear Admiral has arrived. I will say that Kamehameha, after this, doesn't let the ministers have quite as much freedom as they had beforehand. He does keep an eye on them, because it does seem to me they'd been maybe not necessarily outright abusing their office, but certainly utilising their office to conduct personal activities. Just like the British minister, by the way, was using and abusing his office as a consular official to conduct his things. And then there's a declaration made on July the 31st, 5 days later. Immediately, the Commander-in-Chief was made acquainted at Valparaiso in June 1843 of the provisional cession of the Hawaiian Islands under the Right Honourable Lord George Paulet. As the then and there representative of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, he hastened to the spot. No, he really didn't hasten to the spot. He was dealing with a lot of stuff, but he came as quickly as he could.
Whilst dealing with the issues he had at the time, and he was dealing with, he was in charge of. Immediately, so, his first duty on arrival was to seek a personal interview with His Majesty King Kamehameha III, and to ascertain whether these difficulties in which he found himself involved, and the opinion with His Majesty appeared to entertain of the impossibility of complying with certain requisitions which had been made, was so utterly insurmountable as to call upon him to renounce the sovereignty of those islands for the time being. Likewise, whether the cession was a free, unbiased, and unsolicited act of a sovereign power, i.e. had his captain acted properly. The Rear Admiral, having ascertained that the difficulties to which allusion is made in the deed of secession might be surmounted, having convinced His Majesty that he had not properly understood the principles of justice and good faith, which invariably guide the councils of Majesty, the Queen of Great Britain, in all their deliberations, particularly respecting their relation with foreign powers, and that whether it becomes necessary to vindicate the rights of British subjects or redress their wrongs, the government scrupulously respects those rights which are vested in all nations in an equal degree, whether they be powerful or weak, making it therefore a rule not to resort to force until every expedient for a menial adjustment has failed. Having moreover learnt that His Majesty entertained the hope that his conduct was capable of justification, and that such justification he thought would restore to him the authority he had ceded upon supposed difficulties, and having moreover assured His Majesty that whilst it is the earnest desire of the government of Great Britain to cultivate by every means a good understanding with every independent nation, and prevent any of its subjects from injuring those of other sovereigns, either in person or property, wherever they may be located, and that, when it can be avoided, rather than urge compliance with demands which are likely to embarrass a feeble government, its object is to foster and even assist by kind advice or good offices, such as may be disposed to seek its friendly interposition, requiring only in return equal privileges for such British residents as may have been granted to subjects of the most favoured nation. Lastly, His Majesty having given his assent to new proposals submitted to him for the amicable adjustment of the pending differences which led to the temporary cessation of his authority, the Commander-in-Chief of Her Britannic Majesty's ships and vessels in the Pacific, for the reasons herein stated, and as the highest local representative of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, hereby declares and makes manifest that he does not accept of the provisional secession of Hawaiian Islands made of the 25th day of February 1843, but that he considers His Majesty Kamehameha III the legitimate king of those islands, and he assures His Majesty that the sentiments of the sovereign towards him are of those of varying friendship and esteem, that Her Majesty sincerely desires King Kamehameha to be treated as an independent sovereign, leaving the administration of justice in his own hands, the faithful discharge of which will promote his happiness and the prosperity of his dominions. Now, the key phrase in there, of course, was, if we consider it, His Majesty having given his assent to new proposals submitted to him for the amicable adjustment of the pending differences which led to a temporary cessation of his authority. It's such a hidden phrase. Between all the diplo-speak, between all the lovely phraseology, hidden there is, we made some new proposals, They were found to be an acceptable common ground. It's gone with. That's the point at this point. That's what they were looking for. And basically, the Rear Admiral has more latitude, but also by the time the Rear Admiral gets there, the Rear Admiral is a different position than the Captain. The Captain is not an area Commander-in-Chief. He therefore doesn't have the same diplomatic powers vested in him. Which is why you need an acting council to act as an intermediary. This is why there's normally one appointed. So you have the naval hand, which is a rather almost a binary solution situations, can be more flexible by working with the consular, so it can be smart power rather than hard or versus soft. Rear Admiral in this period, a Commander-in-Chief of Station especially, has a lot of power vested in them by the government, a lot of connections, a lot of capabilities, because they are a Commander-in-Chief, because they are that higher level. And so they're able to exercise smart power in, as the modern phraseology goes, because they have both, they're able to be both hands. Both the mailed fist and the velvet glove. Although it is the duty of every sovereign and his ministers and councillors to do all in their power to prevent any of their subjects from injuring those of any other nation residing amongst them, nay more, that he ought to permit foreigners to settle on his territory unless he engages to protect them as his own subjects, and to afford them perfect security as far as regards himself. Yet Great Britain will not consider the public character of the legitimate sovereign of the state, but recently emerged from barbarism under the fostering care of civilized nations, as at all implicated by the aggression of some of his subjects, provided the government does not directly or indirectly sanction any of the acts of partiality or injustice, either by conniving at whilst they were planning or being executed, or by allowing the perpetrators remain unpunished. Basically, it's in the future, make sure your ministers not directly involved in this sort of thing, and our ministers will not be directly involved in this thing. We're going to be having words with ours, don't worry, they will be having words. But this thing cannot escalate. You cannot allow these disputes between merchants to turn into disputes between nations because of who they are. Basically, if your chief minister is getting involved in creating these issues, you need to rein your chief minister in. And if our council official is getting involved in these issues and starting to cause these problems, we will rein them in. But it got too far. It became an embarrassment and affront to our nation state. We're not going to put that in here directly, though. We're going to talk about how nations should be acted, how you should be treated. The inference is always the way through, though, in diplomacy. This is how you're supposed to treat us as well. This is how you're supposed to treat our officials. And where it's saying, holding, this is what we're going to do as well. It's the classic diplomatic doublespeak of this period. If unfortunately a case should occur in which there is an evasion or denial of justice on the part of the government towards British subjects, the course to be pursued is clear, and it will then be the duty of the Commander-in-Chief in such a case of real grievance, which shall remain undressed, to attain that which bad faith and injustice have denied. The Commander-in-Chief confidently hopes that this act of restoration to the free exercise of sovereign authority received by the King of the Sandwich Islands as a most powerful and convincing proof not only of the responsibility he is under to render immediate reparation for all real wrongs committed upon British subjects on their property, but also of the importance which attaches to the maintenance of those friendly and reciprocally advantageous relations which have for so many years subsisted between the two nations. Please note, though, there is a very hard fist there, because basically the Commander-in-Chief just said, and by the way, if you don't do this, then next time the people who turn up is not going to be one captain and a ship, it's going to be me, or whoever's in my post, with lots of ships, and this won't be up for discussion. That will be a cessation of Hawaii. We don't want that. But we can't afford this to happen twice. This got bad enough this time that that captain felt he only had one course of action. And trust me, he was one small frigate. He did not want to do that course of action. Not exactly an occupation force is one small frigate. And he further hopes that neither His Majesty nor his successors will ever forget that to the illustrious circumnavigator Captain Cook, as the first discoverer, the inhabitants of Sandwich Islands owe their missions into the great family of civilized man. And from the lips of Vancouver, another Englishman, Kamehameha the First heard mention for the first time of the true God, which ultimately led to the abrogation of a false worship, idolatry, and human sacrifices, and by the well-directed energies, the ceaseless perseverance of the American missionaries to the establishment of a religion pure and undefiled, accompanied by the advantages of instruction and civilization, the which combined and duly cultivated bring in their train security of life and property, social order, mental and moral improvement, internal prosperity and respect, as well as goodwill of all other nations, more advanced in knowledge of the true faith and the science of good government. This is going to sound terrible, but this is actually the equivalent of standard boilerplate for 19th century diplomatic relations. It's really quite fun when you start looking back on that. And I mean that fun in the sarcastic British methodology, if you haven't yet figured it out, to how we would speak and how we would imagine you should talk to people. Then you look in the period and you look at the phraseology used by almost all powers. Almost all powers, you find this sort of phraseology and say, okay, why is this anyway? It's almost standard boilerplate. It's almost... One of the things you have to realize is for actionable phrases in this document, this is a very long document, a very long written letter, and yet actionable phrases are like 3 or 4 sentences in it. The rest of it is diplomatic boilerplate for the time period. Quite literally what you have going on here. Phraseology which would be expected of a naval officer to be putting in, or an admiral, or any diplomatic issues. Especially once they start bringing up the history. You just know someone had to look that up for them. Blessings and advantages of this nature, the government of Great Britain is desirous of increasing and promoting among the inhabitants of Sandwich Islands by every honourable and praiseworthy means in its power, and thus to enlist the sympathies of the sovereign and his ministers on the sides of justice, which is the basis of society and the surest bond of commerce. Given on board Her Majesty's Her Majesty's ship Dublin at Honolulu, Island of Oahu, this 31st of July in the year of our Lord 1843. Now, I could get into the full agreement, which comes in after that, but I'm going to discuss that after we've talked about Rear Admiral Richard Darton Thomas a little bit. Now, Thomas is a career naval officer. He's also a bit of a specialist in doing diplomacy and dealing with these sort of problems. Usually he's doing it around South America, but he's done other things in his career. He's got knowledge, he's got experience, he's got stability on his side. He's probably one of the most capable officers the Royal Navy is lucky enough to possess at this point. He's also one of the least known by history. Interesting enough, he actually had been trained, one of the captains he'd first served under in 1793 had been Lord Henry Paulet. Captain Paulet's father. I think it's Captain Paulet's father, or is it his great uncle? There is a connection there, but he served on Cumberland, Blanche, Nautilus, Boyne, Glory, Barfleur, Victory, Excellence, Taliad, Defence, Triumph, Cambria, and Leander. He'd fought at the Battle of Martinique, the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, and he'd commanded himself the Chichester, the Athena, the Bellefonds, the Queen, the Ocean, the Ville de Paris, the Undaunted, and the Pacific Station is where he's happily involved. He's enjoying his career in the Pacific Station. He'd been superintendent of ships in ordinary at Portsmouth and Plymouth for a while as well. And he had to deal with the occupation of Tahiti by a French rear admiral. He had to deal with all sorts of discussions with the Americans. In fact, he was appointed an honorary member of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions later on by the United States government. He was considered that good at diplomacy and that good of a intermediary. He had worked well with the Americans, everyone. He's sorting these things out. And he's turned up with what is undoubtedly the most powerful ship actually in Hawaii.
There is an interesting discussion as to whether or not some of the American ships, especially the United States, is more powerful. They have carronades. If they can get into close range, then their broadside could well outmatch his. But at anything over medium, of anything of standard to medium to standard ranges to medium range to long range, there is a goodly chance that his crew, his ship, which has a lot more experience and training, would actually have won because they've got all those 32-pounder cannons. He's also a Razade third rate, so it's a third rate which has been dropped down. To debate as to whether it's a 40-gun or 48-gun ship. I've put in one of the figures I found for 40 guns in 1840 as that form, but apparently he had when he took her, and he had of course been rear admiral in he had been in rear admiral and had been in charge of ships in ordinary in Portsmouth and Plymouth, where I think Dublin had been. He did have her modified before he took her out, and there is a note which says he cared more for guns than silverware. Despite being of a diplomatic style, he cared more for guns than silverware, is a phrase which I found, which was a really interesting phrase to find. It's in a book describing him. So there's another account there which later says it had 48 guns, and yeah, it had basically increased its own carronade strength as well. 14. Which is not an impossibility. It would be interesting, but not an impossibility. And again, not an impossibility for someone with the connections he's going to have in the British system. So he's a capable officer. Now the thing is, he's got all this experience behind him. He's got all this service behind him. He's been sent in to find. Basically, he's come in to, arguably on his own in own stylings, to find a way to chart a course to correct this. The captain's been forced down a certain route. And one of the interesting things is when you read some sources especially from reserve, it's probably Judd who miscalculated. Judd thought he could force himself into the room. If he hadn't done that miscalculation early on, if Kamaha had immediately said, "Come see me," rather than "Go see Judd," there is a goodly chance it never escalates to this point, and we're not talking about the Paulet Affair to this day. There is a goodly chance. The moment it was suggested that Judd should be in the room rather than the king, and it should be negotiated with Judd rather than the king when your complaint's against Judd, that basically forced the captain down to a far more hardline stance. Now, you can therefore argue the captain went too far of it, and I would say probably did, but also the captain is, and this sounds like an offending, but no, it's not. You have to consider the scenario you're dealing with. You're dealing with an officer, and I'm not saying this is a naval officer, as a personality. Paulet is very much a senile am hammer, salute problem solver. Senile am hammer. To him, every problem is a nail. He will hammer it. Doesn't make him necessarily a bad officer. Doesn't necessarily make him the right officer for this situation. Thomas, slightly more of a lateral thinker, but also, thanks to being a rear admiral, thanks to having the experience he has had, and thanks to his own time dealing with the issues with Tahiti being occupied and all sorts of things by the French and other things he's dealt with, he has more experience to be able to draw from, which leads to this. this lovely, lovely discussion. And so, agreement between Rear Admiral Thomas and the King of the Sandwich Islands. And you have to remember, Hawaii is referred to as the Sandwich Islands by the British. Article 1. His Majesty King Kamehameha III hereby solemnly pledges himself to accord unto the subjects of Her Britannic Majesty residing this dominion his protection, and to confer upon and to grant unto them all such rights, privileges, and immunities as are now or shall hereafter be conferred upon or granted unto the subjects or citizens of the most favoured nation. I.e., it doesn't matter which nation you like to grant the greatest privileges to. You can grant them, but then the British citizens will have the same privilege as those. So basically, treat everyone the same. Otherwise, you'll be just treating the British and everyone else better. British and the specific nation better. But, you know, it's again standard boilerplate, and you usually find agreements in the French agreements and the other agreements are the same thing. So ultimately, you're supposed to treat everyone the same. Or all of them better. Once you balance it all out. 2. Her Britannic Majesty Government, having caused the Hawaiian Islands to be visited by Her Majesty's ships of war, with the view to promote and increase mutual confidence and friendship, as well as to foster a commerce alike advantageous to both countries, and the captains of such ships who have herethrough visited the islands, having fulfilled the intentions of the British Government by offering useful suggestions and disinterested advice and information upon points brought under their mutual discussion, which object could only be obtained through the medium of a proper and competent interpreter, His Majesty Kamehameha III and his chiefs of council, sensible of such advantages, engaged to grant readily an interview to the captain of any British ship of war visiting his domains, upon proper intimation being given of the subjects sought for the designed interview, and he will not suffer any obstacle to be opposed to such captains providing himself with a proper and competent interpreter, it being mutually understood and guaranteed that the interpreters of both parties confine themselves strictly and solely to the discharge of that duty. You start to see something coming up here as a theme. Basically, it's that the incident had better not happen again and repeat again, because this isn't how things are played. Interpreters, though, are critical in this one. Interpreters are critical. And that's where what you would have possibly expected would be Judge should have been in the room as the King's interpreter, and Simpson would have been in the room as Paulet's interpreter. And that would be acceptable. That might sound strange, but that would be acceptable. Yeah, there'll be others in the room, there'll be other chiefs, etc., and people in the room, but that would have been an acceptable scenario. The point is, they want the king to hear what they're saying, or whoever the monarch of the islands is, to hear what they're saying, without it being filtered. So this won't happen again, or risk of this happening again won't be as great. His Majesty, having caused to be removed by a public document written in the native and English languages and authenticated by the signatures of the constituted authorities, acting by virtue of the power vested in them by King Kamehameha III, the attachment which had been placed upon the property of Mr. Charlton, Her Britannic Majesty's Consul for the Sandwich Islands, which attachment had been placed at the insistence of an individual not residing within the limits of His Majesty's dominions, and a suit respecting which was instituted in the absence both of the plaintiff and the defendant, all the landed property which had been taken possession of by the government and really appertaining to Mr. Charlton, having also been restored, His Majesty pledges that under similar circumstances the suit shall not be renewed in his court, and he throws himself upon the justice of the British government to vindicate its proceedings herein if hereafter it should be necessary. In other words, please do not touch consular property again. 4. Incidents having occurred in which British subjects have been confined in fetters for minor offences, and before a fair and impartial investigation made, His Majesty hereby guarantees that for the future no subject of Great Britain shall be so confined unless riotous and quarrelsome, and then only for the security of his person. Every faculty shall be afforded, as heretofore, to the individual discharging the duties of Her Majesty's Consul for the time being, to attend the proceedings, or in case of his inability to attend, the same faculty shall be given to any other British subject whom the Council may nominate for that special occasion.
With a view to five, with a view to spare the king and his authorities much unnecessary trouble and adjustment of differences which may and will arise between British subjects and others residing in the country, or between the former and his own subjects, it is agreed that when such matters in dispute cannot be settled by arbitration, but must be decided by incipient laws of the country, a jury shall be summoned to try and decide the cause, one half of whom shall be British subjects approved by the council, and all of whom, before proceeding to trial, shall declare upon oath that they have not been prejudiced the case, and that they are under neither directly nor indirectly interested in the issue of the case brought before them. 6. His Majesty King Kamehameha. Third, having publicly and solemnly declared that it has never been his intention to insult Her Majesty, the Queen of Great Britain, nor to injure any of her subjects, the King will be readily disposed, or as a proof of such declared intention, to accord between himself and his council and whoever may be at the time the accredited British consul or any other persons acting instead by competent authority a direct communication for the purpose of facilitating settlement by referee to the proper courts of such important case affecting British subjects, which the consul or his duly appointed constituted authority may consider it his duty, with reference to his responsibility to his own government, to lay before that of the Sandwich Islands, and before he shall lay the same before his government. 7. As the office of a consul, whose duty is to watch over and protect the rights and privileges of the nations he represents, and to decide disputes between her merchants, is one which has been proved by the practicable civilizations to be mutually advantageous for the promotion of commercial intercourse between two countries, and the avoidance of unnecessary recourse to local government in matters of trivial import. His Majesty actuated by a sincere desire to give unequivocal testimony of his determination to maintain friendly relations with a power he has been taught to respect and to love, hereby pledges for himself and his successors that he will all times be ready to acknowledge the rights of persons duly constituted to execute the office of British Consul, and to afford him ready access to his presence in Council, whenever it may be necessary to lay before him any case of grievance or complaint on the part of a British subject, reserving to himself only the power of the object to any individual nominated ad interim during the absence of such consul, who is prepared to shew his violated his laws despite his authority and made a disturbance in the kingdom, or other good and sufficient reasons to be submitted to British government, and he may any further guarantees to such person so discharging offices of ad interim, and not subjected to, order protection to which a council is entitled by the laws of the nation, and all the liberty and safety necessary to the proper discharge of his duties. Remember that issue? Going back to it, it's a case of no. If an interim one has been appointed, you have to accept them. When you start reading through this, you start realizing it is the most prosaic and diplomatic of fights. It is literally a fight over diplomacy. It's a discord over diplomacy. It's very, very dry. I do agree, if anyone's saying that in the chat at the moment. 8. It is mutually agreed that all other British claims or grievances not mentioned in the foregoing articles, which may have been brought forward, shall be referred to the decision of the government of His Majesty the Queen of Great Britain, adjusted either through representatives of His Majesty King Kamehameha III at the Court of St. James, or in such other way as the British government, or on receipt of full information upon mature deliberation, shall deem proper to propose. 9. In order to avoid giving umbrage to Her Britannic Majesty by any particular partiality being executed by the Hawaiian government at the expense of British subjects, His Majesty King Kamehameha III engages that whenever an appeal affects the interests or property of a British subject, residents and dominions shall come under the consideration of himself and his chiefs at the semi-annual courts, the British consul, or his substitute for the time being, accompanied by an interpreter if requisite, shall be present at such discussions, and shall be at liberty to offer his advice upon the subject under consideration. 10. The whole of the preceding articles are to be subject to the approval and ratification or the modification of the British government, and shall not contravene any of the treaties or arrangements made or entered into by His Majesty's ministers with the government of Great Britain, and nothing herein shall deprive His Majesty of any inherent or acknowledged right vested in an independent sovereign. Now, that's all then signed. And that is really a lovely document, which basically goes in and says, right. So, please, in future, I'm begging you, don't start mucking around with the diplomats. We know they're annoying. We know they're partially to blame. We know. But any disputes between your ministers and our diplomats over their personal financial dealings, in our commercial financial dealings, need to be resolved without them using their positions. And we'll keep ours out of this, and we will. But you have to keep yours out. The interesting point is that nowhere in all these discussions, nowhere in all these points, has anyone suggested that Britain wanted to take over Hawaii. Because they really didn't. Has Lord George Hamilton Gordon, the 4th Earl of Aberdeen, and the Foreign Minister had put back in April. Remember, this is happening in July. Back in April, he'd said Her Majesty's government was willing and had determined to recognise the independence of the Sandwich Islands under their present sovereign. That was the standing point. And yes, there are ships facing off against each other, but Commodore Jones is doing his best to defuse it, and they're actually, one of the fun things that you have going on is they're having dinners with each other. The naval officers are throwing parties for each other. They are engaging in dining events. The king and Paulet's involved as well. And one of the fun things is that Paulet doesn't get any animosity to him from the king. Now, you can say that's advanced diplomacy, but also there's the fact that Paulet basically always acts within accordance of what limitations he's put on himself. He never tries to overstep the requirements. And the moment his rear admiral's there, yep, pass on to you, sir. I dealt with this as best I could. I'm really not as good at this as you. And the rear admiral seems to have gone in to the king and probably said something along the lines of, okay, this is how this is played. You have a chance to have a do-over meeting with me. So the do-over meeting is this. We are going to pretend that the first meetings with the captains didn't happen. Here's the grievances. What is your view? What did you want to do to them about them? Well, I want to solve them this way, this way, this way. Perfect. Perfect. Everyone's happy. Everyone is happy. But I will say this, one of the longer term effects for the British is that the British start to move very quickly away from these people who aren't regular diplomats exercising diplomatic functions. And that leads us to part 5. And part 5 of the declaration is kind of a fun one because it's what the king sends out afterwards. July the 31st, 1843. Whereas certain difficulties and apparent misunderstandings have recently arisen between us and the government of Great Britain, in the course of which some of our subjects, subsequent to the provisional cession of the sovereignty of the islands to Great Britain, and up to the period when we resumed the exercise of kingly power, have accepted office and otherwise performed acts not so required to do by us or our duly constituted authorities, and whereas certain persons have been imprisoned within the time above mentioned, not by our authority, we, anxious to express our gratitude to God, to give the fullest proof of our attachment to the English nation, and to manifest our joy at the restoration of the national flag, hereby proclaim, first, that none of our subjects shall be punished by our authority for any act committed by them or any of them to the injury of our government between 25th February 1843 and date thereof. Second, that all prisoners of every description from Hawaii to Naval be immediately discharged. Third, all government business will be suspended for 10 days after this date, that all persons may be free to enjoy themselves in the festivities and rejoicings appropriate to the occasion. And basically they do have a massive, massive party. And by the way, you can still find in Honolulu Thomas Square, which is named for Rear Admiral Thomas, because he did that good a job. He did that good a job. Apparently it's marked out in the form of a British flag as well. That good a job that they gave him a square. It seems quite nice. It's, quite a sort of appropriate. It's something to remember him by and what he did. one of the things you find out is that when the actual flag was, this is where the flag was pulled, the British flag was pulled down and the Hawaiian flag was raised. There are 21 gun salutes from the fort. Her Majesty ships Carisfoot, Dublin, and Hazard. There are 3 Royal Navy ships there. And the Constellation is in range. But the United States doesn't seem to be still in range to provide for. And the guns at the park also provided a 21 gun salute of it. It's been dedicated as public parks ever since. And it's a fun little thing to have as a bit of history and a bit of advanced events. And it's one of 4 sites in Hawaii where the Hawaiian flag is allowed to fly alone without the US flag. Again, a rather nice little piece of history, but it's worthwhile. If you're in Hawaii, go and see Thomas Square. I haven't ever managed to visit it, but I'd like to. I would really like to. It would be intriguing for me to visit there and think about what happened. I should say that they were all sort of having dinners and celebrations and all sorts of events to restored king, you know. Mostly the Royal Navy and US Navy officers started at that point getting drunk and just kept getting drunker. But, you know, everything was sorted out and it was all happy. Now, France had agreed in 1843 to never, on any pretense, to take possession of any portion of Hawaiian territory. That's phraseology straight out of diplomacy. However, in 1848, whilst they told the consul to avoid in your conduct any show of pugnaciousness or anything like that, the consul had said, "I'm convinced." Not too long after his appointment, "I'm convinced that it will prove sufficient to display a good French corvette for 3 days at Honolulu to force concessions from this devious and hypocritical government." What is the issue? Persecution of Catholics. Repression of French trade was also an issue, but the thing is, the persecution of Catholics and their working against them had actually been used in many regards as a cover for the repression of French trade. This leads to the occupation by the French in 1849, 6 years later. King Kamehameha III is still in power. Now, with that being said, it is actually slightly more aggressive than the British version. They actually invade. They actually take over the French fort. They stand at 140 Marines, 2 field pieces, some scaling ladders. They've taken a couple of frigates with them. They're doing these duties. One of their issues, by the way, is that they want payment to a French hotel keeper of damages committed in his house by sailors from His Britannic Majesty's ship Amphitrite. The British are going, "Come and take that if you want it." But they're taking out on the Honolulu government, on Hawaiian government. And, they literally land, they find the fort has 2 people in it, 2 men defending it. 2 officers of the state. They don't resist. The fort have been evacuated. Unfortunately, there was coastal guns there left there, and so they spiked them. They blew them up. And they caused roughly $100,000 of damages. They also took the king's yacht, sold it to Tahiti, never returned it. They occupied it from August the 25th to the September the 5th. So only for a couple of weeks. But, yeah. The usual minister, Gerrit P. Judd, is sent to settle the incident, leaves for Paris on September 11th. He managed to request support from the USA and the UK. One of the interesting things is when he's getting support from the UK,
one of the people he actually asked to help him get support are the naval officers who were involved in the Paulet Affair. And they do. Because as long as he plays by the rules and doesn't use his office to overrule the consul's office, they don't mind him. They have no problem with him. Just don't do stuff which you're not supposed to. Don't do an affront to the British government. Don't attack the honour of the British nation. When they arrive there, though, he has a very different time dealing with the French government than the British previously, because he arrives. At first, the French are condemning the attacks on Honolulu, but once they get the accounts of their officers, they reconsider. They decide the incident was justified and refuse to make reparations for the damages. And the British and the Americans are going, we're not getting into this one for you. Seriously, you keep doing the same things. You trying to make a set of European nations who've occupied you by this point? The British, let's be honest, the British were not an occupation. It was the French occupation was led by an admiral. The British one was a captain going, I dispute. Oh, God, now I've ended up in the charge of a country. Do you realise how many spaces I'm supposed to be going to in my ship? I'm going to be tied up here for months now until someone more senior gets in to sort this out. The French one was, we're taking things over. And yeah, it was pretty much a rerun of the 43 incident, but this time involving the French, 6 years later. So that being said, we're at the end. The long-term consequences, well, longer term, you end up with eventually the Americans taking over the islands. And again, using similar pretexts, really. Or rather, there is a similar pretext going on, which is a common theme. The interesting thing is how quick Britain and France are both to say they don't want the islands. They really don't want the islands. And here's another question, this week's question for you. Are there other places in the world which the imperial powers conspicuously didn't want to take over? Think about this. What other nations are there in the world that they conspicuously did their very best to avoid taking over, and what were the reasons why? Be really interested to hear what you think about that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this. I think it's going to go out end up being Friday. Mainly because instead of this being all recorded in the morning, you might have noticed the lights change as the day goes on, has gone on. It was supposed to be all recorded in the morning. I'm actually finishing this about 9 o'clock at night on the Wednesday, and I started recording this, well, re-recording this for about the 5th time, or at 7 AM in the morning, because I've been interrupted all day. So I do apologise, but it's just not going to be done early enough to go out on the Tuesday, so it's on the Wednesday. So it's going to go out on it's Wednesday when I'm doing this, so it couldn't go out on the Tuesday. I've gone out on the Friday. I do apologise, but don't worry. That means the first key video of the year is going to be a key leaders video, I think, for next week. So that'll be perfect, and I'll start off then. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed. Toodles. And with that being said, what have we got coming up? We have next week. Oh, John Jervis. Oh, I think I've already recorded that. Permanently angry. Yes, the only person who could probably take on Admiral King in an anger match and stand a chance of almost winning. Actually, no, might actually win. Oh, it's such a close call. I wouldn't like to say actually between the two. They just both permanently angry. Jervis versus King. Sheer amount of anger would be enough to restart a sun between the two of them. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and hope you enjoyed.